This is the Fosi ZA3, and well, this is the competition over the past few years. I'm really excited to talk about this one today. Maybe the best looking and functioning mini budget Class D amp to date. Revisions tend to come left and right on these, but generally speaking, Fosi leads the way in the looks and function department with some recent successes like the V3. So jumping right into the ZA3, it hits you with a few notables, and I won't make you wait for it. We get multiple inputs, XLR and RCA, switchable on the front here. PBTL mono mode with a nice bump in power if you have a pair of these, and even 12-volt triggers. I only have one of these today, but another is on the way, likely within the next few days here, so I'm really looking forward to seeing how well these perform in mono, and just to really open up the capabilities and see how far you can push these in a larger space, paired with something like floor standing speakers. This amp is based off the 3255 chip, which isn't really a surprise. It's basically the bread and butter for these lately. You can get a lot of clean power for relatively small amounts of money, so it's a perfect pairing for things like this. Now let's open this one up right away so we can take a look at the design as well as the cooling capabilities. You can quickly pull these apart with 4 screws and a 10mm for the nut behind the volume knob. It really only takes a minute. And if you look at the view here, I would say these are the top competitors recently, the V3, the A07 Max, and of course the new ZA3. Looking at these, you can see some similarities as well as some differences. The V3 generally has a lot of space, but it does get pretty tight with the sparkless op amps. The A07 feels a bit crammed in comparison to the others, and also the only one with the 50-volt capacitors, but this has since been revised to the 63s. The ZA3 really opens up the space, which I would imagine serves it well for heat between components, as well as the entire enclosure heat dissipation, since they use the chassis as a heat sink. Bigger the better in that case. If we take a look here, we can see some of the premium components that are used. We have WEMA capacitors, Sumida inductors, a soft start thermistor, an Omron relay, as well as the swappable op amps, just to name a few of the key things here. All of these amps have an amp chip mounted underneath, attached to a heatsink. Let's play a game of who remembered the thermal paste. Whoops, V3 missed it. Next, the A07 Max. Yep, that missed it too. Now onto the ZA3. Give me a little drum roll. Yep, they nailed it. They've got it here. Now that we have it back together, let's take a look at the front. Starting on the left, we have this toggle for XLR and RCA. It's really nice to add this additional input here, and what isn't really mentioned very often is that it can accept both XLR as well as TRS, similar to what Topping does in a lot of their balanced connections. In the middle, we have the Fosi burnt orange volume knob. It's an A-taper potentiometer with a similar feel to that of the V3. Where this one greatly differs is how it handles the power on and off function. I had mixed feelings on this. It's a short hold for power on and power off. I think I still prefer it separate here, but at the very least where this has an advantage over the V3 is that on the V3 to turn it on and off, you have to turn the volume fully to the left. The amp switches on when you raise the volume above 0. The problem with that is if you're using this as strictly a powered amplifier into a preamp, you'll lose your volume settings every time you turn it on and off. Versus something like the ZA3, which will be able to maintain the volume you have set, no need to turn it. Just a quick hold to power on and off, or simply use the trigger. Lastly, we have the toggle to go from stereo to mono. I would have preferred this one to be hidden in the backside or underneath, as it's not something you'll be switching very often, and certainly not something you want switched without your knowledge. My suggestion here would have been to keep the simple clean front, 3 items, an input toggle, volume potentiometer, and a separate power button, and then just hide that amp mode into the rear of the bottom. Just a quick ask from you guys, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. I have all kinds of reviews on the way, from new gear to DIY builds to vintage. Likely something for everyone. That's all. Now let's get back to the ZA3. Before we swing it over to the back, we can take a look at the improved casework on this one. New shape, new size. It's a little bit bigger than the V3 or the new A07 Max. We have some ventilation on the sides with some mesh matching the volume knob behind the holes. It's really a good look. The casework on this one really feels nice. It's a solid feeling product in your hands, and the extra size likely has something to do with that. The whole thing just really feels pretty substantial. Getting to the rear, we have the input section, and first up we have XLR or TRS inputs, as well as the standard RCAs. Next to that, we have a big one, and that's a real sub out. And yes, this is controlled by the volume. And I just state that because it's so hit or miss on these mini amps on what we get here. Is it a pre-out? Is it an auxiliary out? Is it an input and an output? This is a sub out, and it works as such. We don't get any sort of selectable crossover. That would have been really nice to introduce some bass management here, but we don't get it on this one, and that's okay. Your speakers will receive the full range and the sub crossover will simply be set at the sub. It's not a big deal or a deal breaker, just something for next time, and for right now, I'm just really happy to see that sub output. After that, we have the typical Fosi speaker terminals, a little on the smaller side and not staggered, but I think they probably ran into some space restrictions on the back with the addition of the XLR and TRS inputs, as well as the sub out and the trigger in. If you take a close look at the terminals, you can see the markings for mono mode. Only the right channel will be active when you have that engaged. Finishing up the rear, I already mentioned the trigger, but I just want to go a step further with that. I'm really happy to see this addition. These may end up being used in a variety of situations, and this really helps out with the flexibility. You could use one, or I guess if you wanted something like 11 of these in your home theater. Most likely use case would be you needed additional amplified channels for rear surround. You could simply use these as an external amp and let your home theater receiver power it on and off with the rest of your equipment. These may even be an upgrade in power and quality over a lot of what is offered in some of the receivers today, so it might be worth playing around with these as a dedicated amp for your primary listening channels as well. Last but not least, we have the power input, and as you can see, it's listed between 24 to 48 volts. And in my case, I'm using the 48 volt 5 amp power supply. So we might as well go right into the expected power out of these. And with a 48 volt 5 amp power supply in stereo mode, we're looking at 150 watts times 2 at 4 ohms, and in mono, 235 watts into 4 ohms. With a smaller 32 volt 5 amp power supply, expect somewhere around 95 watts by 2 at 4 ohms, and mono 110 by 1 at 4. Let's hold up on concerning ourselves with this too much, and wait for more dedicated measurements to come from some of the usual sources. If anything, I don't think they're off too far here. These numbers look pretty spot on compared to what I've seen from other products. So let's just wait and see what happens. They actually didn't provide the 8 ohm measurements either, but based on what I've seen from past Fosi products, I'm expecting around 90 watts in stereo mode from the 48 volt power supply at 8 ohms, and likely somewhere around 50 with the 32. But these are just assumptions based on previous designs, so like I said, let's wait and see. More detailed measurements will be on the way. And what we've seen so far, it looks like a pair of these in mono mode is really going to put out enough power for almost anyone. As far as how this one sounds, I can simply say it sounds transparent and really clean. No noticeable hiss coming from my speakers at idle. Sounds like a really well implemented 3255. Its shining quality is that it can deliver a sound that doesn't push anything in your face. It's very controlled and gets out of the way of the recordings. Basically stays away from coloration. Or in other words, it's really good for the money. The question you should likely be asking is, how does this amp sound connected to XYZ speakers? The most obvious influence in how these will sound will come from whatever they're connected to. And I can say these had no issues running a pair of Arundel 1723 monitors, which is impressive nonetheless. It drove the speakers really well. No obvious audible signs of straining or distortion with the large 8-inch woofers. The resolution and detail was on par with gear costing much more of a premium. I thought a single amp did really well here, up to reasonably loud listening levels. When I get a pair of these, I'll surely run this test again and see if we get any type of improvement in dynamics or control. Next, I paired the amps with the KLH Model 5s, which are known to dip a bit low in impedance, but it wasn't an issue here. Low-level listening, as well as relatively loud levels of volume, were passed along with powerful and controlled amounts of bass. My final pairings involved moving a single amp to a smaller room in my office and connecting them to a classic that I just can't let go of, the Polk LSIM 703s. It had no issues driving these to uncomfortable levels in a smaller space like this, all while maintaining a tight control on the bass. And last up was a DIY project from CSS, and that's the Tories. These really put out a bass note for their size, and the Fosi did just as I expected. It controlled it. It offered a dynamic sound free from the one note boom and doom that we sometimes get. For the person wondering if they need one or two of these, it's possible you could run out of wattage in a larger space paired with a less sensitive speaker. There's always going to be limits like this, depending on your pairings. If you're bringing the ZA3 into a situation like that, you should likely consider going the route of a pair of ZA3s in mono mode, as well as the 48 volt power supplies. And if it's simply going into a small room like an office or a bedroom, it's unlikely you really need a pair. But if you're like me, you're going to use a pair anyway, simply because you can, and there's nothing wrong with that. More the merrier. Sound reviews like this should also be assumed that you're keeping in mind the price range that we're discussing. It's safe to say something sounds better than you think it should at its price point, which is fair for the ZA3. It has the performance I look for, and it actually does sound great for what it is. But I'm also not going to trade in my high-end gear today. We're just generally talking about two different things, and that's okay. But at the same time, I can say this easily sounds as good as mini amps costing substantially more. And it's not so much about things it does better, it's just not making many mistakes, which is a really positive massive step here. Amps like the ZA3 are in such a good place in the market, and I consider all of us to be very lucky in what has been coming to the market this year. Companies like Fosi are taking this very serious and really want to improve their products each revision. If you keep an eye on some of the audio boards, they're actively communicating with users, looking for inputs to further improve their product lines. They seem to be a step ahead of their competition in this regard. A little bit later on, I did bring a sub into the listening sessions, and it simply further strengthened its abilities. I had no issues integrating and setting a proper crossover on the sub, depending on the speaker pairings. When I talk about how well this amp handled all of these speakers, we could have even pushed this a little bit further if we did have that bass management built in, but getting the dedicated sub out was a great first step in this direction. A final rundown on the Fosi VA3 would go something like this. It's a really nice addition to have the XLR TRS connection in addition to the RCA. The volume knob is an improvement over the V3 in that I don't need to change the volume to turn it on or off. That said, I'd still like a separate volume control from the power. Stereo and mono modes available on this amp, which appears to be the direction we're going with these since the A07 Max is offering it as well. I say keep it coming. I like the mini mono blocks. I really like the exterior on this one. It really does deliver over the competition. It's a little larger than most and has some interesting details that separate it from being just a little black box. This one has a dedicated sub out, which I personally feel all of these should have, but it did lack the ability to set a crossover frequency, so we'll be setting that on the sub and running the speakers at full range here. I felt this actually ran relatively cool even with the 48 volt power supply. They did a nice job with case ventilation as well as using the entire chassis as a heat sink. The binding posts are a little tight on this one. I would suggest banana plugs and then you really won't run into a problem, but just probably avoid bare wire or spades in this case. Oh, and I almost forgot that 12 volt trigger that opens up to various use cases like home theater. That does it. I can easily give this one a buy suggestion for anyone looking for a high value amp or two that can really add a lot between its connections and power outputs. Don't discount it just because of its price position. Like myself, I'm not going to replace something like my Audiolab 9000 for this setup, but I would definitely use these in my office or any secondary system like that without hesitation. If you're starting out in this hobby or getting back into it, these could definitely be used in your primary space. Just think about what you're pairing it with, the size of the room, and go from there. One or two of these should fit the bill and leave you with a lot of savings over some of the other options for potentially more funds for other areas of your system. If you're thinking about a new amp purchase or been curious about DIY speaker cable builds without cashing in your retirement, check out my last video, a few fun builds in there. And lastly, if you could like and subscribe to today's video, it'd make a huge difference to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. Let's grow this thing together. A lot more videos to come soon. Take care. Later.